In 1528, nearly 300 men marched into Florida under the Spanish flag. 8 years later, only 4 from that overland force reached Spanish-controlled Mexico alive. One of them was Estevanico, a black Moroccan enslaved man whose knowledge kept entire expeditions moving, yet whose own voice never entered the official record. He crossed thousands of miles through native homelands, learned how to communicate where 6 languages were still not enough, and reached the Zuni world in 1539. 1 year before, Coronado arrived with soldiers and claimed the larger place in history. How does a man survive what destroyed nearly everyone around him, help open the road into the American Southwest, and still vanish behind the names of men who followed? What else have textbooks taught us to remember only because power wrote it down? This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Today, we uncover 10 truths about Estevanico, the black man whose journey changed the map of America while history nearly erased the man himself. Number 1. The man who reached the Southwest before Coronado. For years, many Americans were taught to picture Francisco Vázquez de Coronado as the man who opened the Southwest to the outside world. His name appears on maps, buildings, highways, and classroom timelines, while another man who reached the Zuni world before him is often pushed into a single word: servant. That missing man pushed behind the better-known commander was Estevanico. He was a black man, born in Morocco, taken into slavery, and carried into the Spanish colonial world, without the right to choose where he would live or where he would be sent. Long before he reached present-day Arizona and New Mexico, he had already survived one of the deadliest colonial failures of the 16th century. In 1528, the Narváez expedition landed in Florida with hundreds of men and plans to claim territory for Spain. The expedition soon collapsed under hunger, disease, storms, violence, and disastrous leadership. Years later, only 4 survivors, including Estevanico, reached Spanish-controlled Mexico. Estevanico had crossed enormous distances through native homelands while learning how to travel, communicate, trade, and survive in places Spanish officers barely understood. A man who had endured what nearly everyone else had not, was not rewarded with freedom. Instead, colonial officials looked at the knowledge he carried and saw another reason to use him. In March 1539, Estevanico was sent north again with an expedition officially led by the Franciscan friar Marcos de Niza. Marcos held the title, received the authority, and later placed his name on the written account. Once the party moved beyond the safer edges of Spanish control, however, Estevanico was sent ahead with native companions and messengers. He traveled several days in front of Marcos, entering communities, listening to reports about settlements farther north, and sending information back along the route. Every mile placed him farther from the men who controlled the mission, and closer to dangers they expected him to face first. By late May, his party had reached the region of Hawikuh, commonly called Hawikuh, an ancestral town of the A, or Zuni people. Modern scholars describe Estevanico as the earliest known Moroccan, African, and non-native person to enter what is now Arizona and New Mexico. That description must be handled with care because Hawikuh was never an empty place waiting for a foreigner to give it meaning. It was a living community built generations earlier, with homes around a plaza, ceremonial kivas, cultivated fields, multi-story buildings, and families whose memories were already tied to the land. University of New Mexico materials estimate that the pueblo may once have held about 150 rooms and between 500 and 700 residents. Estevanico did not discover their world. He entered it before Spain fully understood that it existed. Then in 1540, Coronado arrived with soldiers, horses, weapons, and the backing of the Spanish crown. His expedition created letters, testimony, and records that later historians could easily find. Estevanico left no signed journal, no map bearing his name, and no account in his own voice. The man who walked ahead had no power over the story written behind him. For centuries, official records made this unequal exchange seem ordinary, because powerful men alone described what had happened. Spain depended on his courage, his memory, and his ability to speak across cultures. Yet the law still treated him as another man's property. Coronado arrived later, but the machinery of government carried his name farther. The dates remain clear. Estevanico reached the Zuni world in 1539, while Coronado entered the region in 1540. What faded was not the evidence, but the place Estevanico was allowed to hold inside the larger story. Number 2. His birth name vanished. History remembers the name of the man who owned Estevanico, yet it cannot tell us what his own mother called him. The closest surviving description comes from Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, one of the 4 men who survived the Narváez disaster. In his account, published in 1542, Cabeza de Vaca introduces the 4th survivor in a single line: Estevanico, a black Alarabe, native of Azamor. That sentence is almost everything the archive preserved about Estevanico's life before slavery. It gives no parents, no childhood, no exact birth year, no mother tongue, and no name spoken over him when he was born. No surviving page records which name ever felt like home to him. We know that he came from Azamor, a port city on Morocco's Atlantic coast, but how he was taken remains uncertain. Portuguese forces occupied the city in 1513, while war, hunger, trade, and slavery unsettled the region for years afterward. Some accounts suggest he was captured. Others connect his enslavement to famine or sale. None of these explanations can yet be treated as historical certainty. By the time Spanish records begin following him, he is already called Esteban, a Christian name used throughout the Iberian world. No surviving document tells us when he received it, who chose it, or whether he was ever asked. Then, Esteban becomes Estevanico, a diminutive that can sound like Little Esteban. Spanish diminutives were sometimes affectionate, but in a slave society they could also mark dependence and lower status. The name quietly placed a capable adult beneath the men who controlled his movements, even as those men depended upon his knowledge to survive. Another version, Esteban de Dorantes, tied him to Andrés Dorantes, the Spaniard who claimed ownership over him. The records can therefore identify the man who controlled Estevanico, while leaving his father and mother entirely unknown. A name that should have carried family memory instead preserved a legal bond of possession. Even the phrase Negro Alarabe offers no clear return to his identity. Scholars have translated it as a black Arab, an Arabic-speaking black man, or a black person shaped by the Arab cultural world. The words tell us how a Spaniard classified him. They do not tell us how Estevanico understood himself. Today, many Moroccan writers and memorials call him Mostafa al-Azamuri, meaning Mostafa from Azamor. The name restores his homeland and removes the surname of an owner, which gives it deep emotional power. Yet no confirmed 16th century record proves that Mostafa was his birth name. Respecting him requires us to resist 2 very different kinds of erasure. We should not leave him trapped forever inside names chosen by slavery, but we should not invent certainty where the record remains silent. The archive remembered enough to use him, describe him, and attach him to another man. It did not remember enough to return him to his family. Before shipwreck and hunger nearly erased his body, slavery had already begun, erasing the name that belonged to his first life. Number 3. Only 4 returned. 300 men stepped into Florida believing they were about to claim a new province for Spain. 8 years later, only 4 from that overland force reached Spanish territory again, and Estevanico was one of them. The expedition had begun with imperial confidence, as Pánfilo de Narváez carried royal authority, soldiers, horses, priests, and the expectation that another wealthy kingdom might be waiting beyond the coast. Estevanico entered that campaign in the lowest legal position of all, not as an officer or volunteer, but as property belonging to Andrés Dorantes. The disaster did not arrive in one dramatic moment. It grew from decisions made by men who believed command could replace knowledge. In April 1528, Narváez led roughly 300 men and about 40 horses inland near Tampa Bay, separating them from the ships that carried most of their supplies. He believed the place he wanted to reach lay only a few dozen miles away. Modern historical estimates put the coastal distance closer to 1,500 miles. That mistake left hundreds of people walking through country their commander barely understood, while the ships they depended upon could no longer find them. Hunger, illness, resistance from native communities, and exhaustion steadily reduced the force. By the time fewer than 250 men reached the Florida coast again, their promised conquest had become a desperate search for escape. With no ships waiting, they dismantled pieces of their military world to build 5 crude rafts. Metal from riding equipment became tools, clothing became sails, and horses that had once displayed Spanish power became part of the group's final means of survival. Nearly 50 people crowded onto each raft, which floated only about 6 inches above the water when fully loaded. The men who had crossed the Atlantic in ships were now trying to survive the Gulf on fragile platforms that could barely stay above the waves. Wind and currents scattered the rafts, and around 90 people reached the upper Texas coast, but disease, hunger, and years of dependence reduced that number again. By the spring of 1529, only about 15 remained within the scattered survivor groups. Estevanico endured long periods without the protection of any functioning Spanish command. Native communities controlled the food, routes, shelter, and knowledge that made survival possible, sometimes offering help and sometimes forcing the strangers into harsh labor. The men who had entered as conquerors now lived according to the decisions of people they had expected to dominate. By 1536, only Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevanico had completed the ordeal and returned to Spanish-controlled Mexico. Their survival should have placed all 4 men inside the story equally. Instead, the surviving joint report carried the names of the 3 Spaniards. Estevanico had crossed the same waters, hunger, captivity, and uncertainty, yet he returned as an enslaved man whose experience could still be claimed by others. The catastrophe had made his knowledge precious, but it had not made his life his own, under the laws waiting to receive him there. Number 4. Mendoza acquired Estevanico. 8 years of hunger, shipwreck, captivity, and wandering had made Estevanico among the most experienced men in New Spain. Yet, when he returned in 1536, that experience did not open a path toward freedom. It made him more valuable to the people who controlled his life. Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza understood Estevanico's value because he had crossed lands officials could not describe, survived through native networks, and learned to move where maps and titles offered little protection. Mendoza wanted that knowledge kept safely within the government's reach. A letter dated December 10, 1537, says Mendoza had acquired Estevanico from Andres Dorantes so that someone familiar with the northern routes would remain available. Historians often describe the transfer as a purchase, although no surviving contract records a price or preserves Estevanico's consent. The contrast inside this official record is almost impossible to overlook. Dorantes could negotiate with the viceroy, consider returning to Spain, and accept command of an expedition involving friars, 40 to 50 horsemen, and thousands of pesos in funding. When that elaborate plan collapsed, Estevanico remained in Mendoza's hands. He was later assigned to travel with Marcos de Niza and ordered to obey him under threat of serious punishment. The surviving papers discuss horses, supplies, routes, money, and obedience. Yet they preserve no answer to the simplest human question. Did Estevanico want to go? The knowledge he had earned through suffering was finally recognized, but recognition arrived without choice. 2 men who had survived the same catastrophe returned to a society where one could bargain over an expedition, while the other could still be transferred as part of its preparations. Mendoza had secured the man who knew the northern road, What Spain could not purchase was the skill that allowed Estevanico to enter unfamiliar communities and leave them alive. Number 5. He kept communication alive. The record never tells us exactly how many languages Estevanico spoke. It tells us something more revealing. When strangers were frightened, routes were uncertain, and communities spoke differently, he was the man sent forward to begin the conversation. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that the survivors collectively knew 6 languages, yet even that was not enough across the many peoples they encountered. They often relied on gestures, repeated words, local messengers, and people who could carry meaning from one community to the next. Estevanico's role became clear in the moments when words alone could not protect them. On one occasion, an indigenous man fled after seeing the group approach. The others sent Estevanico after him alone, and the man stopped. The account does not explain why, but it shows that Estevanico could open contact where the whole party had produced fear. Cabeza de Vaca later wrote that Estevanico always spoke with the people they met, asking about roads, villages, and whatever the group needed to know. He was not simply repeating another man's message. He was gathering the knowledge that decided where they would find food, water, shelter, and the safe path. Even then, he never worked alone. 2 indigenous women once guided Estevanico and Castillo toward a settled village. One recorded only as a captive, carrying knowledge of the river and people ahead. Estevanico stayed behind while Castillo returned, and later came out with villagers bringing food and supplies to receive the travelers. The men with the highest rank could preserve their distance and dignity because Estevanico did the speaking. Yet the words he used, the questions he asked, and the answers he heard were never written in his own voice. Spain remembered the information he gathered, but it did not preserve the sound of the man who gathered it. Number 6. He became a healer. Their weapons had failed, their ranks had collapsed, and Spain could no longer feed or protect them. What opened the road was something quieter, the growing belief that the 4 survivors could somehow heal. Cabeza de Vaca's account says communities had already heard of their reputation before they arrived. Among the Avavares, Estevanico and Dorantes stayed with one medicine man, while Cabeza de Vaca and Castillo stayed with another. At first, Dorantes and Estevanico did not perform healing rituals, but as sick people were brought forward, all 4 men took part. Those rituals brought 2 profoundly different worlds into the same room. The men prayed in Christian words, made the sign of the cross, placed their hands on the sick, and breathed over them. Native communities may not have understood those actions as the Spaniards did, and the account does not fully let us hear their interpretation. Cabeza de Vaca described miraculous recoveries, including one person thought dead, who later rose, ate, and spoke. His account was not a medical report, and history cannot prove a resurrection. What survives clearly is the power of the story. Once people believed healing had occurred. Families brought children and sick relatives, while communities offered food, hides, supplies, celebrations, and guides toward the next settlement. Their reputation opened a passage that weapons had never been able to secure. For Estevanico, this new standing changed much without changing enough. Spanish law still treated him as a man under another person's control, while people along the road approached him as someone whose presence might bring relief. His influence came from trust, granted by communities, not from any title Spain had given him. Even this hard-earned authority could not secure his freedom, because it made him more useful to the empire, preparing to send him north again. Number 7. He used cross signals. 4 days after Estevanico disappeared toward the horizon, indigenous messengers returned carrying a cross as tall as a man. To Marcos de Niza, that object meant the news ahead was important beyond anything they had expected. The signal came from an agreement before Estevanico moved beyond the main party. A small cross would mean information, a larger one would mark greater importance, and an unusually large cross would warn that reports from the north were extraordinary. Estevanico was not walking a few steps ahead of Marcos, because he was leading an advance group days beyond him. He entered communities, asked about roads and settlements, judged what he heard, and sent reports back through native messengers. The system depended on their memory, speed, and knowledge of the country, yet most of their names never entered the record. The cross did not prove that Estevanico had seen gold, nor did it confirm the existence of 7 cities. At that stage, he was receiving stories passed through communities about Cíbola and settlements farther north. Its size showed how important the information was, not whether every detail had been tested or confirmed. That difference would become dangerous, because Marcos interpreted the signal, while officials waited for news of land, wealth, and people they hoped to convert. Far ahead of the leader, Estevanico was doing the work of a field commander. He decided which reports deserved attention, managed communication across distances, and continued moving, while Marcos remained behind. A man who had no right to choose whether he joined the expedition was now controlling its most valuable information. He could judge what mattered on the ground, but he could not control what Spain would turn that information into. The cross measured importance, while the empire, preparing behind him, would soon mistake that importance for proof. Number 8. The gold myth grew. Estevanico found living communities, but by the time his reports reached Mexico City, Spain had begun turning them into cities of gold. No surviving document written by Estevanico says that he saw golden streets, treasure houses, or 7 wealthy capitals. What he encountered through guides and messengers were reports of large pueblo settlements, multi-story homes, cultivated fields, trade goods, and turquoise. Those details described real societies. Yet Spanish officials heard them through minds already shaped by the conquests of Mexico and Peru. The information passed through many hands before it finally became colonial policy. Indigenous communities spoke to guides, guides spoke to Estevanico, messengers carried his news south. Marcos de Niza interpreted it, and Viceroy Mendoza decided what should happen next. At every stage, meaning could be shortened, enlarged, or pulled toward the hope of wealth. After learning that Estevanico had died, Marcos claimed he saw Cíbola from a distant height, but he never entered the settlement to inspect its buildings or speak directly with its residents. Even so, his report helped persuade Mendoza to send Coronado north in 1540 with soldiers, priests, horses, supplies, and many indigenous allies. When Coronado reached the Zuni pueblos, he found no golden cities. He found communities with homes, farms, ceremonies, families, and histories that had never promised Spain a treasure. The disappointment belonged to the invaders, but the danger fell upon the people living there. A rumor, distorted by distance, had become an armed expedition, capable of taking food, claiming land, and bringing violence into homes that had existed long before Spain arrived. Estevanico had reported signs of a living and deeply rooted world. The empire behind him translated that world into something available for conquest. The treasure was imaginary, but the communities placed in its path were real, rooted there for generations. Number 9. His death remains unclear. Everyone who later explained Estevanico's death arrived too late to witness his final moments at Hawikuh. In the spring of 1539, Estevanico reached the Zuni settlement ahead of Marcos de Niza, with native guides and messengers gathered along the road. According to surviving accounts, he sent word into the community before approaching, but Hawikuh's leaders warned the party not to continue. Estevanico moved forward anyway, although the record never tells us what pressure, confidence, misunderstanding, or hope shaped that decision. His group was reportedly held near the settlement, while local leaders discussed what this unfamiliar procession might mean for their people. There, the written trail breaks apart, because Marcos was not present when the conflict began, and he learned what happened from people who escaped the advance party. Some had seen pursuit and violence, but the surviving reports do not prove that anyone watched Estevanico's final moment. Later writers supplied explanations, with Coronado claiming the death was confirmed after belongings associated with Estevanico were found. Pedro de Castañeda, writing years afterward, said Estevanico demanded turquoise and women. Other accounts suggest Hawikuh's leaders feared he was scouting for an armed force approaching behind him. None of these versions carries Estevanico's own answer, and none preserves direct testimony from the Zuni women mentioned in later accusations. Hawikuh was a living community with every reason to protect its families, food, ceremonies, and territory from a stranger announcing that more outsiders were coming. Modern speculation sometimes imagines that Estevanico escaped and allowed Spain to believe him dead. The possibility is moving, but no reliable evidence proves that he lived beyond 1539. His journey ended inside a silence that other men quickly filled. The archive preserved accusations, rumors, and official conclusions, but not the voice of the man whose death they claimed to confidently explain. Number 10. His memory was fragmented. Tucson placed Estevanico's name on a public park in 1943. Yet the honor carried a painful contradiction. At that time, Estevan Park was one of only 2 city parks black residents were allowed to use. A city could preserve the name of an enslaved African who crossed the Southwest, while still limiting where black families could swim, play, gather, and rest. The sign remembered one man, but the rules around it showed how little equality that memory had produced. Estevanico was never completely absent from the surviving written record. Scholars had written about him by 1940, and his journey appeared in specialized studies for decades without making him familiar to most American students. What failed to travel widely was his complete life. A Moroccan taken into slavery, one of 4 survivors of the Narváez catastrophe. A healer, communicator, scout, and the first known African to enter much of the American Southwest. His story also refused to fit neatly inside one national history. Morocco remembered a son of Azamor, Spain recorded a servant, Mexico inherited a colonial survivor, and the United States often placed black history inside a later English colonial timeline. Writers and artists began gathering those scattered pieces, and Leila Lalami's 2014 novel, The Moor's Account, imagined the voice the archive never preserved. While murals and cultural events in Azamor have returned his image to the city of his birth. Those works offer remembrance, not documentary proof, because no authenticated portrait or personal memoir survives. Recovering Estevanico does not require turning him into another conqueror or pushing the Zuni people behind his story. It requires remembering the enslaved black man whose knowledge changed the journey while powerful men controlled the record. A park preserved his name, but the work of restoring the human being behind that name remains unfinished. When a man can cross a continent yet nearly disappear from its memory, we are left to ask whose stories remain buried. Subscribe to Hidden Black Chronicles and stand with us as we return forgotten black voices to the light. One name, one life, and one truth at a time.